Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Kim Hyun-kyung of Kihasa. Hosted by Kihasa, we are now gathered together to start turning the COVID-19 crisis into an opportunity. We are bringing together experts from New York and Quebec, Osaka and Seoul to discuss and address challenges for a better social security system. Please welcome Mr. Tae-soo Lee, President of Kihasa, for his opening address, and then we will move on to the presentations. Please welcome Mr. Tae-soo
네,
Lee.
안녕하십니까. 방금 소개받은 한국보건사회
Hello everyone. As introduced, I am Tae-soo Lee, President of Korea Institute of Health and Social Affairs. Today we have the 26th Global Social Security Forum
열리게 됐습니다.
under the title of Turning the COVID-19 Crisis into an Opportunity. As you are well aware, today's topic is turning the COVID-19 crisis into an opportunity, addressing challenges for a better social security system. So we are addressing the topics of how different countries are tackling the challenges posed by COVID-19 crisis. So we have invited several speakers, Mr. Taegun Kim, Professor of Adapi University, and Mr. Daniel Ballant, and Professor of McGill University, Mr. Koichi Norimichi, Professor of Osaka City University, as well as our researcher. So we'd like to have a discussions on the situations of different countries taking this opportunity.
고사뿐만이 아니고 모든 그 연구기관 그리고
Not only the Korea Institute for Health and Social Affairs, but also other research institutes around the world are looking into the COVID-19 crisis in a keen manner, and all of us are paying keen attention to how to address challenges for a better social security system.
있다고 해도 과언이
So this is one of the top topics, top priorities by many researchers around the world.
정치, 사회, 경제적 이슈들이 코로나19로
All the political, social, and economic
말씀드릴
issues
수 있겠죠.
have all
저는
converged into the
최근에
COVID-19
그런 생각을 좀
crisis.
해봅니다. 저희
More
사회
recently,
정책에 있어서
I have thought
구사회적 위험,
that
올드 소셜리스트
when it comes to social
산업화 시대 위험을
policies, there were risks under the industrialization period, and after 1990, new social risks came in. So tackling new social risks has become one of the priorities for many researchers. And COVID-19 crisis has emerged as another risk to all of us. So I don't know how to put it. So the COVID-19 crisis is going beyond the old risks, social risks, and as well as new social risks. So the COVID-19 crisis is a completely different challenge to our society. So this is the matter that we are facing. So that's why it is really important to clearly identify the aspect or the characteristics of the COVID-19 crisis. And we need to tackle how to address the COVID-19 crisis, not only from the perspective of the social policies, but also from economic policies. So how to handle and address the COVID-19 crisis is a matter that we need to tackle. So we need to pull all our energy together in order to tackle this problem from an academic point of view as well. I really hope that today's forum can serve as a venue for all the relevant countries to share insights into addressing challenges for a better social security system. The COVID-19 crisis is likely to be with us for the time being. So given this, we need to reinforce our academic exchanges with each other. And we need to make the best effort to come up with the right solutions. And Dr. Lee Hyun-ju of Kihasa Korea Institute for Health and Social Affairs, and discussants, Mr. Youngjun Choi and Mr. Deokyung Lim, who will be part of this discussion sessions. I'd like to thank them for their participation.
같이 이렇게 한 자리에
And I'd
해주신
like to
미국과
extend my
캐나다의
gratitude
교수님들,
to
그리고
speakers from foreign countries, from the US and from Canada and from Japan, for being with us, to be here with us in this forum. I'd like to thank you.
인사말을
So this
마치겠습니다.
ends my opening address.
감사합니다.
Thank you.
Thank you once again, President Lee, for your opening remarks. He mentioned the aspects that we should take away from the forum today. And of course, he extended our gratitude to all of the presenters and discussants. So, once again, I'd like to thank all of the presenters and discussants who will be joining despite the late hours. And now I will hand the microphone over to moderator Hyunju Lee. Good morning and good afternoon. I am Hyunju Lee, the Senior Research Fellow at Kihasa. I look at the evaluations of social policies. So we have presenters from 4 different countries, and we'll move on to our discussion later on. We do not have enough time, so I believe that we'll have to rush ahead. So we have 4 presenters and 2 discussants once again. We'll be able to allow 15 minutes of presentation time for each person, so excuse us for cutting short your presentations. So without further ado, I will move on to the presentations, have a short break, and then move on to the discussions. Moving swiftly on, I'd like to invite Professor Kim Tae-gun of Adelphi University. Can you hear us, Professor Kim?
예, 잘 들립니다.
Yes, I can. Thank you. Yes, please go ahead with your presentation.
예, 안녕하십니까. 김태은입니다. 먼저 귀한
Hello,
자리를 마련해
thank
주신
you once
보건사회
again
연구원에
for the
감사드립니다.
invitation
최근 몇
to
달간
Kihasa.
그 청청
For the
연구자들께
past
질문을
couple of
받으면서
months,
코로나
we've
대응
had a
정책에
lot
대해서
of
잘못 알려진
questions,
부분들이
and there
우려를
are
많다는 것을
some
알게 되었습니다.
questions and comments that are misunderstood related to the U.S. COVID-19 policies. So in this regard, I believe that it's very meaningful that we have this forum today. I will look at the overall big picture and background of the goal of the misunderstanding of the U.S. pandemic response policies, a summary of the trajectory of the U.S. policy response, and then examining the impact of the pandemic. And today, it might be a little bit more of a macro perspective because of the limited time. A lot of the countries alike, I believe, has had a big effect from the pandemic. In the United States, the number of confirmed cases was 47 million, and the number of deaths was 760,000. There was a nationwide lockdown for 2 months, and last March, the Goldman Sachs had warned the U.S. economic collapse, and it was completely a collapse of the fundamentals of the U.S. economy. However, the recovery was quite fast in terms of the economy. If you look at the macroeconomic factors and the indices, then that shows explicitly. If you look at second quarters of 2020 and second quarter of 2021, the unemployment rate decreased by 9.6%. The GDP growth rate was 78%, and the Dow Jones Industrial average was 175% growth. So in just a matter of 1 year, there was a huge recovery. believe that that was because of the interventions of the U.S. federal and central government. In April or March of 2020, there was an unprecedented amount of coronavirus aid relief and Economic Security Act, about 2.2 trillion won. And in December of that year, there was a second stimulus package with $900 billion. And in March of this year, there was the American Rescue Plan Act with $1.9 trillion. So in total, you can see that it's around $4 to $5 trillion. And if you think about the overall spending for the U.S. federal government's policy budget, it's about $4.9 trillion. And it was around 40% of the GDP. That was the highest level since World War II. If you look at the red circles, it's comparable to the 1930s Great Depression and the Great Financial Crisis of 2008. You can see the relative size of the policy budget. As you may know, the United States has really uncovered the vulnerabilities of the welfare program and regime. However, through this, they've actually uncovered a new opportunity. In the United States, it was more about American exceptionalism with the small government and residual welfare. It has transitioned into an expanded social policy of aggressive government spending and welfare expansion. The biggest change was that there was the return of the nation state. In the United States, it's now transitioning into this nation state or the welfare state. For this, I would like to look at the analysis of the policies, the CARES Act, the second stimulus package, and the ARP Act. All of them are passed as a package of bills, including the stimulus check, unemployment benefits, and so on. I do not have the time to look over all of the elements, so I will only look at the cash support, the stimulus check policy in this presentation. If you look at the process study and the diachronic approach, there's a lot of focus, but less focus on the social policy. So I will look into the policies, but also the different policies and policy regulations and the interconnectedness between the two. Here are some of the acts and the legislations. And I also would like to look at the organic connections between the two. Let's first look at the establishment of the CARES Act. The other two are really deeply rooted in this CARES Act, so we have to take a look at this. Last March, there were a lot of voices raised that there needs to be a huge impetus for change in the policies. And at the same time, there is a strong need for an influx in cash policies, as well as it provided to be a stepping stone for further financial policies. This was the overall length of the legislation was 3 weeks from proposal to approval. It was a rapid landslide recovery. And it's actually led by the leading party. In just about 2 weeks, the initial budget of 1,200 trillion won doubled to 2,400 trillion in just a matter of 2 weeks. Now let's look at the 3 different aspects: the household, business sector, and public sector. You look at the support for the household, you have 2 key policies. First is the stimulus check, and the other is the unemployment benefit. In the CARES Act, the stimulus check
완전 수급을 위한 소득 기준이 개인
was
7만 5천
more
불,
about
그리고 부부
the
15만
beneficiary
불,
criterion.
이후에는 10만 불, 부부는
For
20만
individuals,
불까지
it was
의존적으로
75,000.
감액된
For
금액을
married
받을 수
couples,
있습니다.
it was
그 사이에 페이스 아웃 존을
$150,000.
적용한
And then
것이죠.
you have the phase-out
대략적으로
zone
우리
that's
국민의
applied.
86%
So
정도가 완전 수혜 대상에
86%
포함이 되고,
of
그리고
the
부분
United
수혜까지 합할
States
경우 미국
population
국민의 한
was
91%
provided.
정도가 포함된다고 볼 수 있습니다. 한편 완전 수급액의 경우 성인 1인당
As for the
1,200불,
maximum
그리고
benefit
아동
for
1인당
adults,
500불을
it was
지급되었습니다.
$1,200. For children, it was $500. The payment method was the automatic payment based on the 2019 IRS data. You didn't have any kind of application process. It was just automatically provided. It was actually not quite 2 weeks after President Joe Biden took office.
그래서 사회 모든 방면에서 2차 구제안, 일명
And
케어스
the
액트에
CARES
대한
Act
요구가 대두되기
2
시작합니다.
is now being promoted from the public.
연방공개시장위원회 발언을 통해서
And through
부재한 구조, 그러니까 언더슈팅이 부재한 과잉,
the Fed's
오버슈팅보다
sentiment,
훨씬
you
더
can
큰
see that
위험이다.
undershooting is
라는
riskier
입장을
than
표명하면서
overshooting.
2차
This was
구제안의
the
불가피성을
official
역설합니다. 이에
announcement
민주당과
by the
공화당은
Fed.
각각 3,600조 원의 히어로즈 액트와 1,200조
And so
원의
the
케이스
Democratic Party as well as the GOP are all catering towards this act. The Democrats are talking about the HEROES Act, the Health and Economic Recovery Omnibus Emergency Solutions Act, worth $3 trillion, and the GOP looking at the HEALS Act, worth $1 trillion. The Trump administration's plan was around $1.7 trillion, proposing a $2,000 stimulus check. However, this was criticized by the GOP and supported by the Democrats. If you look at all other policies, there are differences in opinion from the central government, and that's why it's still pending. I mentioned the package deal, and if you think about how the politicians were not able to achieve consensus in just one element, the overall package deal does not pass through. And then after this was opposed, they had the November elections. This actually had an enormous effect on the pandemic recovery efforts. The key was about the Senate. The GOP took 50 seats, Democrats 48 seats, and undecided 2 seats were in Georgia. But this was actually in Georgia, which is the major GOP party, and the majority will probably win. And that's how they had come up with the second stimulus package.
이제 협상의 주도권은 당연히
And now,
재선에 실패한 트럼프 백악관에서 공화당 상원 원내 지도부로 넘어가죠.
this
입장에서는
the deal had turned over to the leading party.
겨우 법안을 통과시킬 수 있었습니다.
And that's how they were able to pass the second stimulus package. And this was passed in December of 2020. And it's more catered towards the HEALS Act from the GOP's plan. For individuals, it was around $600, which was a big drop since the initial suggestion. And it was a legislative victory of the GOP. And there's a big catch. The Democrats employed a $2,000 stimulus check as a major election strategy. And in Georgia, to pick the 2 remaining seats of the Senate, the Democrats completely won both seats in the runoff. And so the Democrats seized power in the administration in both chambers. It's also very important to note that the Biden administration launched a stable political landscape as a result. If the Senate had not gotten both seats or just 1 seat out of the 2, I believe that this package would not have been able to pass through. So the second stimulus package was truly a victory, a strategic victory for the government. So the Biden administration completely talked about cooperation among the both parties, and this was a true win for the party. Looking at the government as well as the Senate, it was very difficult to pull through. However, the Biden administration proposed a progressive policy issue. And the political confidence based on favorable public opinion resulted in the 70% support for the third relief plan. And there was also a support for the intervention of the government. And if you look at the changes in the camp within the Democrats, there was an advance of the Progressive Caucus after the November elections. And there was also the rise of the Progressive Senate Budget Committee chair, which became Bernie Sanders. And he actually mentioned that it was at this moment when we have power to do something right, we will use it in a bold way. Based on this background, we had the establishment of the American Rescue Plan Act. The total budget was $1.9 trillion, and it was an extension of the CARES Act's major policies. The CARES Act was a landslide victory. However, this one was more of a Democrats' biased vote through budget reconciliation. This is thinking more about the post-pandemic recovery as well as institutional reform, such as the introduction of the child tax credit. The Biden administration released the mega social standing bill, which was around a whopping $3.5 trillion. And now there was the third stimulus check, which was the same condition as the CARES Act. However, it was not $2,000 per person, it was to $1,400 per person. I had looked at a different kind of perspective on this, but $1,400 per person was Joe Biden's opinion. So he was announcing that he had kept his pledge, but then also appreciated the other parties' suggestions as well. So the United States government had provided the population, up to 91% of the population, with relief funds. And through the CARES Act, second stimulus package, and the ARP Act, around 14 million Korean won, which is $11,500. And by family, it was around $3,300 for the unemployment benefits, and all in total, it was around $48,000 per household. So you can see the overall trend. The CARES Act to respond to the pandemic, and then the Booster Act, which was the second relief fund, and then the ARP Act, which was more of a post-pandemic institutional policy. And I believe that this social expenses bill is completely different from the other three. This is a more progressive act that has the potential to completely change around the overall policy directions. And now, the progressive agenda in the Washington, D.C. White House has now set forth after the pandemic. This looks into the tuition waive, universal pre-K, child tax credit, and Medicare expansion. This is actually a progressive agenda that surpasses the New Deal policy. It also includes student loan forgiveness around $50,000 per person and the child saving account for $9,000 per child. It's also introducing the wealthy tax and increasing the corporation tax rate, which was waived by the previous administration. I'm not sure how much of these policies will be able to bear fruition. However, I believe that it's quite significant in the fact that the government is actually proposing these bills. This is a huge step for the U.S. government to transition into a nation state. And there has been a change in the social policy. The experience of the free healthcare access, inappropriate market wage, and efficacy of the financial support. There has never been a case in which the U.S. has provided these kinds of policies. And they also felt how the government support is effective through a pandemic, and the government also experienced that they could still survive after having provided such stimulus packages. And the opinions and the support for the progressive agenda has now shown that the U.S. has now the basis for social policies. Now it's actually looking into the social spending bill in the United States. It's more of the main game after all of the three different policies. It has now passed the House of Representatives. It's still pending in the Senate. So we are all focusing on whether and when it will be passed. Now I would like to provide some suggestions while I conclude. Social policy is a product of a political process, and it provides an insight into the government as well as the overall environment. The United States has now experienced a big divide in the political directions. For example, the Trump care has failed, and the fact that Obamacare has succeeded is providing some food for thought. And under this trend, I believe that our researchers truly need to think about the significance of the politics analysis in social policy studies. Well, thank you very much for your attention, and I'd like to conclude my presentation here. Thank you once again, Professor Kim Tae-gun. It wasn't boring at all. I think that it was quite apt in looking at how policies can make the transition into a welfare state. Thank you very much for your presentation. Now moving on, we will go over to the Canadian example. Professor Danielle Beland, professor at McGill University. Can you hear me?
Yes.
감사합니다. 교수님, 저희가 15분 정도의 발표 시간을 드릴 수 있습니다.
Thank you. Actually, 15 minutes will be given to you. I'd like to ask for your understanding for the short 15 minutes for your presentation. So, Professor, please go ahead with your presentation.
Yes, thank you very much. I'm really pleased to be here with you today, and I will now share my screen. When we talk about social policy responses to COVID-19, Canada is an interesting case. I will focus here on cash benefits, and then we'll talk about vaccination procurement. This is important to understand. Canada is, of course, a federal country. In terms of public health measures, there was a lot of variation from one province to the next. Today, I will focus more on the role of the federal government and what happened at the national level. But it's very important to understand that to really study the pandemic in Canada and its effects, you have to break down the country into different regions and focus on, alongside the federal responses at the provincial and the territorial level. And it's something I will allude to in this talk, but I will focus on federal responses. if you, in comparative perspective, especially if we compare Canada with the US, Professor Kim just spoke to us about the US, the reaction of the federal government in terms of helping the unemployed and really stimulating the economy was extremely swift. There was much less partisan conflict in Canada over COVID-19 than the United States. And overall, the country has been more successful in tackling the pandemic than its a big southern neighbor. If you look at COVID-19, of course, you have the fourth wave. Some people are even talking about the fifth wave now. And when you look at the situation in Canada, there was a lot of internal variation. I won't bomb you with different graphs about what happened in the different provinces, but certainly in the first wave, Quebec was the most affected by the pandemic. But in other waves, prairie provinces like Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba were much more affected by the pandemic in terms of number of cases per capita or the number of deaths. So it's a vast country, and you see a lot of variation over time during the pandemic in terms of how severe the pandemic was, and also, of course, really the regional variation. So it's quite complex picture when you look at the actual effects of the pandemic across the country. What's important, I will focus on really the economic and social protection responses of the federal government. So of course, just to show you how dramatic it was, you know, how many jobs were lost in a very short period of time. Really in the spring, in March and April of 2020, you can see compare with even the 2008 financial crisis or previous recessions, you see that this was absolutely unprecedented. Of course, after that, we started to regain jobs, and unemployment rate, which was, you know, 5.6% in February, increased dramatically to 13% in April, but now it's back at 6% in November of 2021. So it dropped really fast in terms of the number of jobs. Unemployment rate increased really, really fast, but since then, it has been declining gradually to return to basically the number it was just before the beginning of the pandemic. But I'm showing you this picture to imagine the state of mind of politicians and decision makers in March and April of 2020, when the federal government in Canada enacted bold measures to respond to what was potentially an economic freefall, an economic catastrophe that could have had lasting consequences. So of course, what I told you about unemployment, decline in participation rate in terms of the labor market, so that was really dramatic, and the federal government reacted really swiftly. Now, before I talk about one of the most important measures enacted by the federal government in response to the COVID-19 pandemic, I want to allude to the introduction of a special issue of social policy and administration that I co-edited with colleagues who are mentioned here. And in this special issue, we talk about two main trends that we have identified in the different studies published in that special issue, which covers Europe, North America, and East Asia, including Korea. The first is that there was, across the different countries, across the different welfare regimes, we witnessed a swift response. And so there is some form of convergence among countries in terms of adopting deficit spending and really implementing rapid responses to the pandemic in the face of what was really an economic catastrophe. At the same time, what we show in our special issue is that there is some continuity in terms of the policy responses within each country that is based on existing policy legacies, the existing policies that were, of course, that existed in that country before the pandemic. In terms of Canada, when you look at the social policy response in Canada, and here I point to an article that I published in Social Policy Administration and the special issue I just mentioned, which compares Canada and the United States. But here I will just focus on Canada. I think Professor Kim really did a great job at discussing the situation in the United States. What we show in that article, drawing on the first 5 months of the pandemic in Canada, we really show how swift the response in Canada was compared to the one in the United States, which was slower. There was more partisan conflict in the US than in Canada. And the federal government, which was in a minority situation in Parliament. So Justin Trudeau, a Liberal Prime Minister, did not have a majority of seats in the House of Commons. And so he had to get the support from at least one opposition party at the time to get things done. Despite this, the Liberals under Justin Trudeau were very successful in getting things done in a matter of weeks. Very, very rapid response. And a problem that federal policymakers in Canada faced at the beginning of the pandemic is that our unemployment, well, in Canada, yeah, EI is employment insurance, but it's really known in other countries as an unemployment insurance system. This program was really flawed, and people have known that for a long time. People had known that for a long time, that only a minority of people losing their job will actually qualify for benefits, because the eligibility criteria of that program were quite stringent, and the benefit levels were quite low. So what the federal government did, based on existing policy legacies and the emergency of the situation at the time, they decided to push this unemployment insurance program aside temporarily and to enact a new program to help people who lost their job or lost major income because of the pandemic. This was a dramatic move to basically suspend a program for the new claimants, right? People who were already receiving unemployment benefits, of course, kept receiving money from that program, but people who were directly affected by the pandemic, they turned to that new program, massive federal program that was created by the federal government. This program was called the Canada Emergency Response Benefit, CERB. This was a massive yet temporary program, and what was really interesting about it, it was not like in the US sending checks to taxpayers, or it was not like in, say, Germany or other European countries, just increasing or expanding unemployment insurance benefits. We created a different approach in Canada. People could apply to benefits, and there were some eligibility criteria in terms of how much income you had lost because of the pandemic, and this was basically done in a way that people will apply. The federal government will send them the money, will send them a check, and only afterwards the federal government will look into whether they actually meet eligibility criteria. So the idea was to send money to people as fast as possible, people who needed the money. This was much faster than using unemployment insurance, the unemployment insurance approach. And the federal government was able to really send billions and billions of dollars to Canadians affected by the pandemic in a matter of weeks. So very, very fast. The benefits were $500 Canadian dollars a week for up to 16 weeks. This was taxable benefit. And what's interesting about this program, it was very short-lived. It was created in March 2020, and it was dismantled in early October 2020. So it basically lasted half a year. But during that half a year, the program allocated $82 billion to 8.9 billion people. It's about a third of all workers in Canada who receive that benefit. Now, this program was combined with many other measures. And I won't go over all these measures because I have limited time here, but we had a wage subsidy program, major wage subsidy program that was created to help employers keep their workers rather than laying them off. We had smaller targeted programs for students, we had extra money for pensioners, many targeted programs. Also, when the CRB was dismantled, it was replaced by the Canada Recovery Benefit, which was a smaller program to help people affected by the pandemic. And now this program, the CRB, was just dismantled. So this program lasted a bit more than a year. So Canada responded with a lot of temporary measures, temporary programs, but really massive programs, which means that the federal deficit, which was less than $40 billion in 2019 and 20, increased in 2020-21 to $314 billion. So it's a massive explosion of the federal deficit. Now, Canada could afford this in a sense because our debt to GDP ratio was quite favorable before the pandemic. And also, of course, the interest rates are so low that the cost of the debt for the time being is really affordable. But this may not last, of course. This year, the federal deficit has declined already and should decline gradually over the next few years, although deficit zero is not in sight. We are improving our fiscal standing as we phase out these temporary programs. And as the economy recovers, I told you unemployment, for example, unemployment rate is now down to 6% compared to 13% in April of 2020. Now, the economic recovery that we were seeing in Canada is related in part to efforts to protect people against the virus through massive vaccination campaigns. Now, in Canada, vaccination is really under the control of the provinces, the territories. In terms of vaccination, it's done at the subnational level. But the federal government played a key role in terms of procurement, in terms of buying as many doses of vaccine as they could in late 2019 and 2020. And so that was really a shopping spree. And we bought way more than we needed. That, of course, raises some issues in terms of global equity and redistribution. But the problem with Canada is that we had a very limited domestic production capacity. We were not able to make our own vaccines, and so we had to rely on other countries, foreign manufacturers. We had also to deal with vaccine nationalism of countries like the UK and the United States, who didn't want to share the vaccines that they produce on their soil for the most part. So we signed these contracts with Pfizer, Moderna, and other companies. At first, it was very difficult because some shipments from these companies were delayed. People were angry. The federal government was criticized by opposition parties and by the media. But in the end, by the spring, mid-late spring, vaccination rates in Canada increased quite dramatically. And now Canada, which was lagging behind other liberal welfare regimes like the UK and the US, which have domestic production of vaccines, now Canada is ahead of the US in terms of vaccination rates, which is quite a stunning development, which has helped, of course, reduce some of the pressure in terms of confinement measures, public health measures, which is, of course, helpful for the economy. Despite this, there are still major problems in some parts of the country, As I said, Canada is a very big country, and there is a lot of variation in terms of the scope of the pandemic and its effects, not just regionally, but over time during the 4 and perhaps now 5 waves of this pandemic. But we can say that overall, and you look at vaccination rates, Canada is now, among the leaders in the world, much higher than some people anticipated just 6 months from now, or at least 9 months from now. Many people in Canada were skeptical about the gamble that the Trudeau government basically took, which is to go abroad and buy all these vaccines, hoping that they will be shipped on time, instead of trying to build national capacity for production during the pandemic, which they are now doing, right? They are doing that now, but at first their strategy was to buy as much as possible abroad. And in the end, it paid off. Conclusions. When we talk about social policy responses to COVID-19 in Canada, I think Canada was extremely bold, was swift in its actions, especially when we compare to the United States and other liberal countries like the UK. These responses have been temporary in nature and related to the economic downturn. But in the next project, what I'm working on now with my colleagues, we are studying the potential long-term consequences of the pandemic. And in Canada, the pandemic has really reshaped the policy agenda. Like Professor Kim said about the United States on childcare, for example, it's happening in Canada as well. There is major debate right now on long-term care for older people, major debate on childcare, and the federal government now has pushed for a federal childcare strategy in an aggressive way and is signing agreements with the provinces in this area. And you have also a major debate on healthcare funding in general. And as well, although it's not as dramatic, a discussion about the future of unemployment insurance in this country, because the program is obviously flawed, and we had to basically push it aside, at least partially, during the first months of the pandemic, and that shows that this program needs to be repaired to get ready for the next crisis, the next economic crisis, or the next pandemic. In terms of vaccination procurement, I think it's really important to understand that there is also a lesson to be drawn from that, which is that we need national production capacity. We need to increase our national production capacity. We did succeed in the end with our procurement strategy, but there was a lot of uncertainty about it. It delayed the vaccination process for a number of months. And frankly, there is a sense in Canada among policymakers from most political parties that we won't let that happen again, and we need to to rebuild our infrastructure in terms of vaccination and the production of vaccines in this country. And that is an issue of national security, especially when you have vaccine nationalism in countries like the United States or in the UK during the crisis don't want to share what they produce. I think that a country like Canada and other countries, they have to react, take note of this, and build their own capacity. Thank you very much.
감사합니다. 캐나다의 사례를 굉장히 현금 지원을 중심으로 하셨지만 지원 방식에 대해서까지도 알려주셨고,
Thank you very much for the presentation. The effects of the vaccine on the policies as well. So after a certain while, the Canadian public's response is also an issue that we'd like to know more about. Now we will move on to Professor Koichi Norimichi from Osaka City University. Hello, thank you very much. Excuse us for not being able to give you more than 15 minutes. I hope that you will be able to explain to us the case study of Tokyo and of Japan. Yes, please begin your presentation.
Greetings to everybody, and I'm really pleasure to be here and sharing this panel with distinguished scholars. Thank you very much for the invitation. I will overview Japanese government responses to the pandemics in terms of social security and welfare, and analyze their effect on income inequality and poverty during the pandemic, and discuss the main issues to be addressed in the social security and welfare system. I'm looking forward to exchange ideas in the other countries. In the beginnings of December 2021, the cumulative number of positive cases of COVID-19 in Japan was 1.7 million, and the government has issued emergency declaration 3 times and announced comprehensive economic measures on December 2020. The total amount of these fiscal expenditures is about 88 trillion yen, 777 billion US dollars, which is more than 3 times as large as the fiscal expenditures during the last financial crisis of 2008 to 2009. In October, Fumio Kishida was elected as a new prime minister, and the new government are now trying to introduce a new social benefit pay to all children. This table shows main allowances, loans, and subsidies, which the government has provided during the pandemic. First, welfare fund loans. This is provided by the Council of Social Welfare, which is a private organization supported by the government on the Social Welfare Act. During the last financial crisis in 2008 to 2009, the amount of the loans was increased rapidly, about 24 billion yen by annual average. During the pandemic, the total amount of loans was more than 1 trillion yen, about 9 billion US dollars. This is more than 40 times of the financial crisis. Second, special fixed benefit payment, 100,000 yen, $883 was provided uniformly to all those who were registered on the resident registration system, regardless of whether their nationality was Japanese or foreign. And the total budget was about 30 trillion yen, about 115 US dollars. Third, housing security benefit. It has been provided to those who have been out of work or out of business for less than 2 years. As a characteristic of Japanese government responses to crisis, the basic policy is not to expand the existing system, but to introduce emergency programs. I think this is the main issue addressed in Japan in near future. The basic policy in Japan has led to overburden of work in the municipalities' workers. This is partly because the introduction of digital technologies has been much delayed in the public administration in Japan. This figure shows Japanese government responses to COVID-19 in terms of social security and welfare. And this is also based on a 3-tier system, although some elements have been newly added. One of the newly added is the employment adjustment subsidy, which is classified into first safety net. This is paid employers whose business conditions have deteriorated and who do not lay off workers, but instead make employment adjustments such as reassignment. It is used only in terms of emergency, such as economic crisis or pandemic. The other welfare fund loan. It has been used since the end of World War II as a livelihood security measure in times of economic crisis and disaster. This figure shows a backplot of average disposable income for each income group from January 2020 to June 2021. The disposable income in January 2020 is shown by the solid line. The disposable income June 2020, when the special fixed benefit was distributed to each household, is shown by the dotted line. This one. The figure shows the disposable income in January 2020 is at a low level throughout the period, especially for the middle and low income groups. On the other hand, disposable income in June 2020 has increased significantly for all income groups. And it is also at a high level throughout the period, indicating that the special fixed benefit have had a significant impact on all income groups, especially the middle income group. It can be said that the government support measures had a great positive effect in supporting household finances. This figure shows the Gini coefficient of market income and disposable income during the pandemic, although highly fluctuated. Gini coefficient for both market income and disposable income are increasing during the analysis period. January 2020, Gini coefficient for market income is 0.23, and for disposable income, 0.21. While in June 2021, Gini coefficient for market income is 0.31, and for disposable income, 0.22. Gini coefficient, both and disposable income are gradually increasing. This figure shows the unemployment rate, the number of unemployed persons, and the rate of recipient of unemployment insurance to total unemployed persons from April 2007 to June 2021. During the financial crisis, the unemployment rate rose to 5% in June 2009, and the number of unemployed increased to 3.64 million. While during the pandemic, the highest employment rate was 3.3% in October 2020. The rate of recipient of unemployment insurance also increased during the financial crisis from 20% November 2007 to 28% in 2009. It has been declined to around 20% since 2010. But since early 2018, it has been increasing, reaching 27% in March 2021. But this increase was not triggered by pandemic. This figure shows the number of employed persons not at work in 2008 financial crisis, this line, and in the current pandemic, in terms of the number of months elapsed since the outbreak of the crisis. The financial crisis was started in September 2008 when Lehman Brothers went bankrupt, and the pandemic has outbreak in January 2020. The figure shows that the number of employed persons not at work increased rapidly 4 months after the pandemic. In contrast, the increase in the number of persons not at work is smaller during the financial crisis. This suggests that companies responded to the pandemic by adjusting employment rather than cutting jobs. Employment adjustment subsidy has worked to restrain the expansion of unemployment, especially at the first stage of pandemic. Until May 2021, the caseload of public assistance has gradually increased over the last 20 years, but it has been almost stable during the pandemic. Whether total caseloads increase or decrease depends on both inflow and outflow effects. Even if inflow decreases, caseload increase if outflow more decreases. In order to compare numerically the effect of inflow and outflow, we have performed a counterfactual analysis. This figure shows the result. The number of households receiving public assistance has been around 1 million since mid-2015 and has not changed much. The effect of inflow rate had a large impact on the increase in the number of households receiving public assistance in 2008 to 2009. But since then has been declining. And since the middle of 2015, it has been at a negative level. Overall, the inflow has a negative effect and the outflow has a positive effect. And these two effects are offsetting each other, leading to no change, almost no change, in the number of recipient households in total. In terms of the impact of the pandemic, there was no significant change in either the inflow or outflow effects. Special loans are provided not by the government, but by private social welfare service organizations, that is Council of Social Welfare, CSW. Loans of CSW has been used as livelihood security during economic crisis and disasters, mainly for low-income households. This loans delinquency rate has been very high. Some delinquency rate was nearly 70% in 2019. In 2020, it has apparently greatly decreased. This is due to the large amount of loans provided in 2020 during pandemic. It should be noted that many of these loans are likely to become delinquent in the near future. This figure shows the survival rate of unemployed people and indicate duration dependency. The orange line shows the survival rate of unemployed people who has been unemployed at least for 1 year. It seems to be increasing gradually during the pandemic. This may be a sign that long-term unemployed people has been increasing. Most of them are 40 to 60 years old. Even after the pandemic, it will be difficult to find stable jobs as before. This is a summary. Special fixed payment had a great influence on people's disposable income, but income inequality has been gradually expanding during the COVID-19 pandemic. Unemployment rate has been relatively stable, and the number of recipients of public assistance has not been increased compared with the financial crisis. Maybe this is due to the emergent support by the central government. In the other words, existing social security system has not been utilized. There are a huge amount of people who are in debt now. Many of them are young, single, and have been working as self-employed. There is a sign that long-term unemployed people has been increasing. Most of them are 40 to 60 years old, and it will be difficult to find stable jobs even after the pandemic. In order to prepare for the next pandemic, it is necessary to build a system to provide assistance quickly, efficiently, and effectively, rather than on ad hoc basis as at present. The function of Social Security is said to be automatic stabilizers, expanding during recessions and contracting during booms. In post-COVID-19 world, we need to develop a system to automatically deliver assistance to the people in the event of a pandemic or disaster. In Japan, it was widely reported in the media that the provision of social fixed benefit took a very long time. In the case of assistance to small and medium-sized enterprises, the conditions to approve were relaxed so much for the purpose of speedy delivery. As a result, it caused a lot of injustice. This can be prevented by the development of automatic stabilizers. In order to achieve this in Japan, however, it will be necessary to promote the digitalization of public administrations, as well as to revise the roles between the central government and local government in terms of the social security system. In addition, in order for digitalization to spread among the Japanese people, it is necessary to remove their concerns about the misuse of personal information and restore their trust in central government. 이상입니다. Thank you very much.
감사합니다, 교수님.
Thank you very much, Professor. You mentioned about the overall policies from the Japanese government. And you also mentioned that the overall unemployment rate has been relatively stable. However, there have been some requests for the automatic delivery of these relief funds. I think that there were a lot of interesting points that we could use as discussion points. Next, we will have the presentation from Korea from a research fellow, Hyun-Kyung Kim of Kihasa. I will give you 15 minutes. Thank you.
Good to see you all. I'd like to talk about policy responses to COVID-19 in Korea and the prospect of social policies. And this is the content of my presentation. First, COVID-19 situation and changes in employment and income. And secondly, I'd like to talk about policy responses to COVID-19. And lastly, I'd like to talk about the prospect of social security direction. First, this is the status of the number of cases of Korea And as you see here, COVID-19 new confirmed cases and responses. For about 2 years, the development of the new confirmed cases was like this. So the first supplementary budget was spent, which was worth about 11.7 trillion won, and there were second supplementary budget execution and third supplementary budget execution. So in total, there were 7 supplementary budgets programs that were executed. So I'd like to go more in details with the specific content of the main programs a little later on. And this is about the number of employees and growth rate. So from March 2020, the number of employees has been decreased, and in September and October, quarantine measures were reinforced. So that led to a reduction in the number of employees. However, after that, there has been a steady growth. And please take a look at this graph. And these are showing the increases and decreases in terms of the different age brackets. And starting from 2020 March, the number of jobs related to females has been decreasing sharply compared to that of males. And please take a look at the growth rate concerning the youth aged between 15 and 29. Compared to the other aging groups, the youth saw the biggest decline in the number of jobs available for them. So this indicates that the youth was hit hard by the COVID-19 crisis. And the shock to those aged between 19 and 29 was more severe in terms of males. So we need to pay keen attention to the youth employment. And lastly, please take a look at those aged between 30 and 49. Despite the fact that there was not that much increase in the number of employment for females, after the COVID-19, the recovery rate of the female employment has been slower than the other age brackets. So due to COVID-19, already the vulnerable experience more vulnerable situations, and the burden of the COVID-19 job loss was more given to females. And next. This shows the changes in income. So there are 5 quintiles. So between 2019 and 2020, you are able to see the income growth rate here through this slide. This is the results of the statistics. So from the 3rd to 5th quintiles, actually, we categorize them into one group. So in terms of the labor income, there are differences between the 1st, 2nd quintile and the quintiles from 3rd to the 5th quintiles. Especially for the bottom 20%, they saw a biggest reduction in income. So the negative 26.1% decrease in income in the first quintile. And in case of the second quintile, they saw a decrease of 13.2%. So the low-income class people was hit hardest among income classes. And at the bottom, you see the impact on the current income. Actually, the picture is quite different from the upper one. So the characteristics of the recent crisis is that actually there was a big impact on the lower income class. But unlike the labor income, in terms of the current income, there has been not that much decrease, as you see. So it is showing a steady or moderate growth rate, which is positive. For the all general public, there was a cash support given by the government, so that made an impact on this. And this is about the supplementary budget executions by the government. As I mentioned, there have been 7 supplementary budget executions. In most of the cases, a subsidy was provided to job creation or to relieve people from disaster impact. Except the last program, I have organized the content of the supplementary budget execution programs in this graph, in this table. There are many kinds of support programs. Also, there is other support programs related to small business owners and so on. But I'd like to talk about the employment security related things. In relations to employment, there was the job retention subsidy, and also the subsidy was for the vocational training. And please take a look at the light green part. So there was an income support to low-class households in the lower income classes. So there was a cash transfers to low-income households. And under the COVID-19 crisis, cash transfer was playing an important role. And more recently, in July 2021, there was another big cash support for people in Korea. So the first and the recent one, actually the cash support, has been playing a crucial role in the total supplementary budget execution programs. And many times, emergency employment security subsidy has been provided. However, it was difficult to identify which needs to be targeted here in Korea. But in order to enable those in need to get the support they need, we have improved their access to subsidy. So these are the characteristics of the policy responses to the COVID-19 in Korea. And the cash support programs has taken up the large share of the supplementary budget execution. And employment security and job retention subsidies has taken up also the large portion. And this is the content of the emergency disaster relief payment. For example, in the second supplementary budget executions in 2020, 12.2 trillion won was spent for the emergency disaster relief payment, and that was the universal program to every citizen. And one person household got 400,000 Korean won. But in case of the pandemic relief payment, there was a discussion or debate on whether to make it universal or make it targeted. And as a result, so the pandemic relief payment was made to the bottom 80% of the total general public. And there was a lot of discussions on whether we had the right criteria based on which we are able to identify who are the right targets. So this is the issue that we need to tackle continuously for the future. And I'd like to talk about employment security. As I mentioned, job retention subsidy was provided as part of the job retention scheme. However, the job retention subsidy did not take up the large portions of the government budget. But when we take a look at the OECD countries, the amount that was spent by Korea in terms of job retention was smaller than that of the other OECD countries. So compared to the other countries, the level of support for employment security, especially in relations to job retention, has been small here in Korea compared to the other countries. And so that led to less than expected impact on the outcome of the execution program. So there are two major issues that we have identified for the Korean society. One, the first issue is the discussion on sickness benefit. Of course, we have other programs like National Pension Program, Employment Insurance Program, and the Industrial Accident Compensation Insurance Program. However, there has been no sickness benefit given to those who lost their income in case of their sickness not related to their work. So there has been no sickness benefit so far here in Korea. But with the COVID-19 crisis becoming prevalent, we saw the need for the adoption of sickness benefit. And lastly, the second issue is that actually the employment insurance for all citizens of Korea. So the Korean government is in pursuit of applying the employment insurance to every citizen. But as you see here, at the moment, for the full-timers, 89.2% of the full-timers are covered by the employment insurance. However, in terms of the irregular workers, only 46.1% of them were covered by employment insurance. So we need to facilitate the rate of increase in these figures and numbers. So there are dependent, self-employed people and many other people who were not covered by the employment insurance. So we have a plan to adopt employment insurance for the dependent, self-employed people from July 20, more in full swing from January 2022. And so applying the employment insurance to every citizen has become a big priority. And we are in the working of identifying the system so that we can identify the real-time income. Thank you. Thank you for listening.
지금 발표해 주신 거 들으셔서 아시겠지만
So yes, as you are well aware, through these presentations, in a short period of time, the Korean government needed to address many issues at the same time. So during the short presentation, the presenter made an effort to combine all the major content of the government programs. So taking the opportunity of the COVID-19, Korea began to adopt more programs suitable for the Korean situations. So we'll have a short break, and then we'll have a discussion. Before that, before we move on to the Q&A session, the two discussants will have discussions together. After the two discussants' discussion, the four presenters or the speakers will address Q&A session. So about 5 minutes will be given to each speaker. So after two discussants' discussion, there will be a Q&A session with 4 speakers. According to the original schedule, we are supposed to have a 15-minute break. However, because of the time constraint, we'll have a 5-minute break. Thank you.
So we will now begin our discussion session. Excuse us for cutting the break time short. For those of you who are now joining us through Zoom, please make sure that your cameras are on. We have two discussants, Professor Choi Young-jun from Yonsei University and Associate Research Fellow Im Do-kyung of Kihasa. First, I'd like to hand the floor over to Professor Choi Young-jun for maybe 5 to 10 minutes.
Thank you so much for your excellent presentation. I can only see my face, but it would be great to see my colleagues' face too in the screen. Right, yes, thank you. Hey, thank you, Professor Daniel Baland, Professor Kim, yes, Professor Norimichi, and Dr. Kim. I really enjoyed your presentations. It's a really, the world is upside down. And so there are so many interesting stories in welfare state. And there are so many things I also wonder, and I'd like to give some questions to you. The first question is the motive behind the reform. What is that really the social policy reform, or is that part of the economic recovery package? I know it is really difficult to distinguish a social policy from economic policy, but I think there is a kind of a dominant motive behind this reform. For example, like in the US, the title, literally speaking, I mean, there's a stimulus package, right? The stimulus probably is a stimulus not about the people's livelihood. It's more like a stimulus about the economy. So it sounds more like the package is more about the economic policy rather than social policy. But in the end, that stimulus package actually leads to the comprehensive welfare reform. So I think that's another story. But the first question is I want to ask the motive behind this reform. And probably it's a little bit different. The US is more like a stimulus package, whereas Canada, the government specifically tried to target the unemployed people and the people, those who are in need. So I think the motive are slightly different in Canada and the US. And also in Japan, there are some programs more like welfare programs, but also there's a kind of a special allowance to everybody. It also quite similar to the US style, the stimulus package. So what's the kind of a policy discourse behind the relief program? And the second question, I have some comparative questions. The Professor Kim showed about the comparative figure between the 2007 financial crisis time and the now pandemic time. But there is a very little social policy effort in 2007 and 2008 financial crisis, whereas this time is very, very different. What is the kind of a critical difference between 2007 and 2020? That's the kind of a first comparative question. And the second probably comparative question probably goes to the Daniel. You know a lot about the European countries. So, if I look at the IMF statistics, then the highest spender is the US, Canada, Japan. And then there are a bunch of European countries, especially the Nordic countries. They did not really spend much in 2020. And Korea is one of the lowest spender. We spend about 3-4% of GDP, whereas three countries, Japan, US, Canada, I think there's about 13 to 14 additional social policy expenditure of GDP. So I think there are the huge difference between us as well as the EU and the European counterpart. So what's the kind of a difference you observe? And in Korea, we also spend very little, and probably need to ask Dr. Kim why you think, whereas other liberal and also East Asian welfare state, they spend a lot, whereas we spend very little, and that could be another question. And one of the observation is possibly, the Korea. I just looked at what's the difference between Korea and the U.S., Canada, and the Japan. We rely much on the trade in terms of our economy. It's like a 70% of GDP rely on the trade, whereas Japan, U.S., Canada rely much less on the trade, and rely a lot on the domestic market and domestic consumption. So possibly that might be the reason, but I want to listen to your opinion. And the next question is about the political process. I definitely agree what Professor Kim said in his conclusion. The product, social policy is a product of political process. But also, I think still this time is a little bit different. I mean, the usual political stories in liberal welfare state is, the liberal side asking, more welfare than the Republican or the conservative side always talking about the budget limit, and also national debt is problematic. So, there's a kind of, the tug of war happened. But this time, the Republican and conservatives in your countries, it seems like they quite generously accept, the very overshooting, and also as Professor Baland mentioned about this, the deficit and debt issue, and this is problematic, although the interest rate is low. But at some point, the interest rate would go up, as we see now. So I think the people would predict the interest rate would go up in the end. But still, they very kind of boldly increase their spending. So why is this behind this the program? Whereas in Korea, we don't spend much, whereas our politics is very fierce. Whether we should give it to everybody or we should target. Although we spend only 3-4% of GDP, I mean, our politics is never quiet. It is a very, very vocal, and the two parties, and they argue each other, and it's also a social debate as well. That was my third or something questions. I forgot how many questions I actually gave to you. But my next question is about your tax administration system. The Professor Kim mentioned about the U.S. used the 2019 data to select who are eligible for the benefit, and also in Canada, also you use you provide 1/3 of populations, and then you need a kind of a tax record or earnings or income record to screen who is actually eligible or not. Then what's your observation? Is that kind of your tax and income administration data is reliable, and there's not much kind of a controversy around, selecting those in need and not? That's my next question. And then what is the outcome you expect from this emergency relief allowance program? So, for example, consumption boosting, is that the kind of important dependent variable? Or the poverty rate, inequality rate, Gini coefficient? So when you introduce these programs, I'm sure the government wants some kind of outcome and some kind of target. Or what is the target in your country you want to achieve? And also in terms of in Japan, we call it helicopter money from time to time, this kind of giving money to everybody. Then I know before when you did it, and there are some controversies whether this universal allowance is really effective enough to boost consumption or the people's livelihood and so on. So after all these debates, you did it again. Then any kind of policy discussions in terms of these outcomes and effectiveness about these programs? That's my next question, and this is my final question now, finally. My final question is about what would be the next. I think the US story is fascinating. You're starting with the stimulus package, but now there's elections and Joe Biden won, and then now Bernie Sanders somehow in the Senate chair and played an important role. And then now you're about to introduce very comprehensive welfare reform. It's something like a 1930s kind of a New Deal and Social Security Act. Probably initial motive probably was not really social policy, but in the end, now this motive actually and these programs is about to overhaul the American welfare state. I'm not sure whether that would really happen or not. But so what's your observation, Professor Kim, from now on? What do you expect? What would be the kind of a key reform in a special package about to introduced? And also, what about the Canada? So, we are all living in a small welfare state, and then we see the vulnerability of our welfare state during the pandemic. This is not enough. Then probably we also Korea, as Dr. Kim showed us, we try to introduce more and overhaul our welfare state. And what about the Canada and Japan? Any kind of more permanent changes you expect from now on? If so, then what are the kind of a reform effort in your country? Thank you so much. I really enjoyed your presentation. Yeah. And so sorry about so many questions.
예, 다음 임덕영 박사님.
And next, Mr. Dak Young Lim.
네, 안녕하십니까. 만나 뵙게 되어서
Hello, everyone. Nice to see you all. And I am Deokyeong Lim from KIASA. So I majored in social welfare, and also my keen area of research is the housing welfare. And recently I have been looking into the national plans for welfare policies of Korea.
또 큰 틀에서의 복지국가 성격과
And in the big framework of welfare policies, tackling today's topic is really important, and your presentations was very interesting to me. So I'd like to thank 4 speakers for giving us such an excellent presentations. Before I go into discussion, I'd like to brief you on the commonality between 4 presentations. What comes in common is that actually all of you talked about the increased role of governments or nations. And the increased role was characterized by a massive investment, government investment. And also, it was not just about taking advantage of the existing programs only, and the governments have come up with the new programs in order to deliver cash immediately to those in need. So that was one of the commonalities in my view. And through these new and temporary programs, what kind of changes will be brought about is a big question in my head. So that is the biggest question that we need to tackle. And in relation to this, I'd like to suggest to have 3 kinds of discussions today. First,
레짐의 변화의 문제입니다.
and I'd like to tackle the issue of the changes in the welfare state regime. As the last presenter mentioned,
김태근 교수님의
there could be some changes in the welfare state regime, and the examples of the America, the U.S. and Canada
회로의 이행 가능성을
showed us many indications about what can be done in welfare states. So along with social policies, what kind of changes will be made to welfare states will be an important topic in my view.
유효한 것인지
And is it effective to maintain the existing framework? And will there be any change in the criteria that was applied in the existing framework? So these will be the important questions that we need to address. And also, in case of Japan and Korea,
어떤 방향으로 복지국가가 재구축될 것인지도
in what direction welfare states will be rebuilt? So this is the question also we need to think of.
레짐에 어떠한 영향을 줄
So lastly, I'd like to sum it up. So what kind of changes will be brought about as a result of the COVID-19 crisis, especially to the welfare policy and the social policy? And second, there is the discussion. There should be a discussions on the adoption of new systems. It seems that selecting the targeted people of a certain programs is something of an existing policy systems. But I believe that today's programs are temporary. These temporary programs may serve as the foundations for making changes permanently. However, at the same time, some temporary programs may end up just being temporary. So that will not lead to progressive permanent changes. So there is a need to talk about permanent changes. So various kinds of very progressive agenda in the United States and the examples of the Canada, and also the adoption of sickness benefit in Korea are presenting us new directions to take. So I'd like to raise two questions here. But what about Japan? So in case of the Japanese presentation, there was an explanation on the new programs or policies, not talking about the leverage of the existing systems in the response to COVID-19 crisis. So I'd like to ask you to explain more on that. And secondly, who are the major actors? This is the question I'd like to ask all of you. So in the existing welfare state, there was a conflict or compromises between the employer and the employee. So the welfare policies came up in the negotiation process in the past. There is a notion of a nation under the concept of universalism. However, in more and more, we find ourselves, we feel like there are no major actors like laborers or workers, people. So who were the major actors in the response to the COVID-19 crisis? And this is the questions to every presenter. And lastly, despite the introduction of universal programs, there could have been, or there must have been, some people who were excluded from the recently introduced programs. So despite massive investment, there must be some people who are still suffering, for example. So the one single person households or the youth who suffered a lot in the process of tackling the COVID-19 crisis could be the examples of those vulnerable. And also, there is another group of people. For example, the senior citizens were the ones who were hit hardest. So the youth and the senior citizens, for them, rather than temporary subsidy, proper provision of housing facilities and sustainable income must be more helpful. But as the last presenter, Mrs. Kim, mentioned, this is why there is a kind of debate or controversy here in Korea over whether to provide these benefits in a universal manner or in a targeted manner. So under the universal program, there are still people who were lagging behind, who were excluded. So I'd like to talk about this matter as well. And lastly, so I'd like to talk about the homeless people that I am looking into as part of our research. So to those people who don't have any housing facilities and don't have any proper ID numbers, so to those homeless on the street, what kind of benefits or support should be given to them? And the number of homeless is so many here in Korea, and the vaccination rate of the general public is 80% here in Korea. However, it is difficult to collect any data about vaccination rate of those homeless on streets. So in order to provide a universal program to everyone, we need to collect more data on these people. So this is the short summary of mine. Thank you.
So I think that most of the questions were for all of the countries, and so I hope that each country will be able to respond to all of the questions altogether. So summarizing the questions, I think that it's first, it's about the effect of the policy, not only the economic effects, but also the limitations of the policy catered towards the vulnerable sectors of society. And not only about social change, but of course about the next step. I think that we could focus more of our discussions on that part, on what comes next, not just about this immediate change. The United States also mentioned a little bit, but I hope that we can discuss this about how to have permanent policies and change come about from these changes. There were some changes in the overall discourse about the policies of or regimes. It's more about the universal policies or selective policies which are more important or which are more effective. In particular, of course, it's temporary, but there are some effects on the universal coverage and universal implementation of the policies. As I mentioned before, based on your own experiences in your countries, I hope that you will provide your 2 cents. And for Professor Che also suggested the comparison between European policies. Maybe we can also, it would have been nice if we could have a presenter from the European countries, but if you can provide your opinion, please do so related to the European countries. So we'll move forward with the order of presentation. Professor Kim first. So thank you very much for your inputs for the 2 discussants. I only have a limited time, so I will try to speed up. First, for the CARES Act, as you can see, it's a stimulus package, but it's also a package deal, and we have to focus on that point. It's not just about one policy, but it's also about the cash stimulus, the unemployment, and the industrial recovery. So all of it is covered. It's a comprehensive package deal. With the name itself, you can it's not just a simple stimulus policy for economy or society. It's encompassing various other sectors of the society. As Professor Che has mentioned, the start of the CARES Act was the Stimulus Act that was implemented in 2008. That's when they actually used the name Stimulus Act. I think that it's a politics of naming. In the United States, when they come up with new policies, they really put a lot of focus on the name. Recently, it's about child tax credit instead of child allowance. I think that that's a very political decision because it's not just about allowance because people get a lot of burden, but it's actually extending the tax credits to children. So that's how you actually minimize the oppression behind it. So, of course, it's a stimulus package, but you also have 2 factors inside. You're trying to enhance the domestic consumption. It's also a Keynesian theory to boost consumption and to revitalize the economy. But on the other side of the coin, it's also about relieving the financial stress that's put on the households. Another aspect is the difference between the financial crisis in 2008 and 2009 to 2021 to 2000. I think that the biggest aspect is being go and fast. In 2008, it was a similar implementation, but the overall duration took about 5 to 6 months. However, at the time, they weren't able to be effective and they weren't able to provide immediate implementation. So from the
현금액이
point
지급될 때까지
of
5주밖에 안
discussing
걸리는
the
그런
policy
정책적인
to
정책을
actual
폈던 것입니다.
implementation,
그리고 또 한 가지
and
차이는 그때
it only
당시에는
took about 5
스티뮬러스
weeks.
체크 하나
At
또는
the time, it
실업급여
was
하나
just about
이런 식으로
stimulus package and
부분적으로
one
문제 접근을
with
했기 때문에
unemployment
오히려 그런
support. So it was only
부분적인
two
접근이
pieces
문제
of
해결에 큰
legislation,
장애가 되었다라는 비판이 있었기 때문에 이번에는 그런 것들을
and that's why
고려를 해서
in this
좀
time
더
around, that
공격적이고
was put into
그리고 적극적으로
consideration,
재정 지원을 했다고 볼 수
and
있습니다.
providing
그다음에 또 한 가지
support in a more
얘기하셨던
aggressive
것
way.
중에 하나가
Another question that was posed
소셜
was
스pen딩 bil
about
같은 경우에는
the social
그
spending
재정
bill.
적자 문제와 인플레 문제 두 가지 중에서
And
미국에서는
out
특이하게
of
이번에
the deficit
그
and the inflation issues,
팬데믹을 거치면서
the United
대규모 사회 정책이
States
있었음에도 불구하고 정부의
had
재정 적자에 대한 문제들은 그렇게 크게
issues, or it
문제시되지
didn't really have a lot of
않았습니다. 대신
issues with
문제가 됐던 것이 이제
deficits,
인플레이션
but it was
문제인데요.
more about
근데 재미난 것은
inflation.
그 인플레이션 문제에 대해서
The interesting fact
방어적인
is
입장을
that
취했던 것이 연방 정
the
그러니까
federal
연방
government,
준비제도
or
의사였습니다.
the
파웰
Fed,
의장 같은 경우가 세 차례에
Mr.
걸쳐서
Powell
인플레이션은 크게 문제가 되지
was
않고 그다음에 오히려
mentioning
사회
that
정책을 확대했을 때
inflation
그것이
wasn't a
인플레이션을
big issue,
장기적으로
but
안정화시킬 수
if
있는
we
그러한 도구가 될 수
extend the social
있다라고 주장을
policy
하면서
for a longer
연방 정부의
period,
재정적
that
확대
will
정책을
be able
지지를
to
하는
support
그러한
stabilizing
입장을
the
표명을
inflation.
했고요.
That's
그리고
how he
아까 그
announced
다른
it.
임 박사님께서
And
중요한 액터가
Dr. Lim
누구인지에
also
대해서
asked
질문을
about the
하셨는데
most
제가
important
봤을 때는 미국
actors.
같은
I think
경우에는
for
그
the United
정치라는
States,
과정이 가장 중요한
it's
액터라고 생각하고 그리고 그 정치에
the
영향을 미치는
lawmakers
것이 바로
and the
여론이라고
policies,
생각을
as
합니다.
well as the public that
왜냐하면
actually have an
이번에
influence over the
소셜
policies.
스pen딩 빌 같은 경우에는
As for the social spending
단기적으로
bill,
그냥
it
코로나
was
팬데믹 위기를 극복하기 위한
to
그
recover.
제도라기보다는
It wasn't just
장기적이고
to
그다음에
recover
미국
from the
국제
COVID
국가
pandemic.
자체를
It was
변화시킬
about
수
a
있는
longer
굉장히
term,
진보적인 내용들을 많이
transitional
포함하고 있는데요.
and more
근데 그와 같은
progressive
진보적인
policy.
미국에서 그와 같은 진보적인 사회 정책이 입안됐을 때는
And when that kind of
1930년대
progressive
위기라고
policy
그리고
was
1960년대
implemented,
Great
it's
Society
about
시기입니다. 근데 그 두 시기의
we only have
공통점은
two cases in the
전부 다
1930s and
민주당의 압도적
1960s.
승리로
There was a
상원과
landslide
하원을 다
victory
장악했다는
of
것입니다. 그런데 오늘
the GOP,
지금 현재
and they
민주당
had
같은
taken
경우에는
over
상원에서
the
분열을
House
이루고
and
있고
Senate.
그리고 하원에서도 약간의 그 우위를 점하고 있거든요.
So they
근데 이와
actually have a
같은
slight majority
불안정한
in
정치
the
상황
House
속에서
as well
민주당이
as
그렇게
the Senate.
과감한 정책
So
기조를 변화시킬 수 있었던
that's
이유는 저는
one
기본적으로 미국
major
여론의
momentum
거대한 변화라고
as to
생각합니다.
how they were
이
able
여론의
to push
변화는
forward
팬데믹
with this
이전
kind of
때부터
progressive
이미
policy.
2018년도
If you look at
Occupy Wall Street
2018,
운동이
2019 with
때부터
Occupy
자본주의에
Wall
대한
Street,
어떤
there had been a lot of
그
criticism
반대라든가
and
이런 것들이
questions,
누적이 되면서
skepticism
팬데믹을
on
거치면서
capitalism.
미국의 여론이 사회
So the overall
정책이라든가
public
아니면 정부의
has
적극적 개입에
an
긍정적으로
effect
변했다라고 생각합니다.
on these policies,
할 수
and
있나요?
that was
아니면
a
다른 분의
positive
의견을
influence. Yes, I think that we could also
yes.
move on, and we'll give you a little bit more
알겠습니다.
time during the comprehensive discussion. Next,
다니엘
Mr. Daniel Belland.
답변을 부탁드리겠습니다.
Thank you. Well, a lot of different questions here, so I will try to go really fast. The first question from Professor Choi, I agree with Professor Kim about the fact that it's hard to disentangle economic policies and social policies. Obviously, social policies play a major economic role, even in normal times. But during a massive crisis like this, I think their economic role becomes even more central. And it's true that in Canada, emergency social programs were used to help families and workers, but they were also used as part of a Keynesian strategy or a deficit spending strategy to avoid an economic collapse. And that's what we explain in the introduction of our special issue of social policy and administration on COVID-19. So we don't draw a clear line between economic policy and social policy. I think that they were very closely intertwined during the pandemic as they are beyond it. Second question, in terms of why Canada and the US spend so much compared to some other countries, I don't think that deficits matter that much anymore in North America politically. Trump, even under Trump, the economy was doing quite well, but enacted big tax cut like George W. Bush before him. They have huge federal deficits in the US, and they are living with them. In Canada, the Trudeau government in 2015 during the campaign before Justin Trudeau became prime minister, they decided that balancing the budget at any cost was not a priority. So they've been running deficits since 2015, even before the pandemic, when the Canadian economy was doing really well, because they have a high spending agenda. They are a not social democratic, but say, center left government. And when the pandemic occurred, they just decided to spend even more. They didn't care about deficits that much before the pandemic. And of course, during it, they just decided to go for it. I think there is something ideological about it, but it's also related to public opinion. In the mid-1990s in Canada, where we face a very major debt problem, and when the cost of the debt was so high, interest rates were higher, Canadians were convinced by economists and politicians that balancing the budget was really the priority. But this kind of public sentiment has really declined over time. And it's no longer a priority for politicians. Even conservatives now are saying, they said that during the last federal campaign this summer, that they were not in a hurry to balance the federal budget. In terms of the tax data, yes, we have pretty accurate tax data in Canada. The problem with the CERB, the Canada Emergency Response Benefit I talked to you about earlier, is that they decided to verify the eligibility criteria after the fact, after people had received the money. And what happened is that a lot of people had to repay the money. They had to repay the benefit later on, and they are still repaying as we speak. And that is causing a lot of problem, because we talk about hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people who receive benefits that they were not entitled to, and now they have to repay through the tax system, and some of them have spent the money already. So that's creating some political and social tensions. For Professor Lim, Dr. Lim, all these are good points. I don't want to speak for too long here. In terms of welfare regime and whether the pandemic will lead to permanent changes to the welfare state, say in Canada, we have an article coming out in a special issue of Policy in Society that I'm co-editing with Alex Hay from Hong Kong. And this is coming out in the spring of 2022. And in this article, written with the same co-authors, I wrote this article on Canada and the US and the special issue of Social Policy and Administration, we do argue that in the case of Canada, there is a continuity in terms of, the Liberal government of Justin Trudeau before the pandemic expanded the welfare state, expanded public pensions, which is quite rare nowadays in an era of population aging, expanded child benefits. And in the aftermath of the pandemic, it's now expanding childcare in a big way. So they had an expansionist agenda before the pandemic, and they have used the pandemic to expand on that. In the US, it's quite different, as we show in our article, forthcoming article, which I can send to you if you email me. We show that in the US, there is much more discontinuity because, of course, the Trump was in power at the beginning of the pandemic. And now you have, of course, the Biden administration, and we have seen a shift. And when you look at Build Back Better bill and so forth, there is a shift towards progressive social policy in the US that Professor Kim has talked about. So I think that's quite an interesting contrast here between the US and Canada. And politics matters, as Professor Kim said, especially partisanship and partisan control. In Canada, the Liberals have been in power since 2015. In the US, it's much more complicated, in part because of checks and balances, the fragmentation of political power at the federal level, but also because we saw a shift from, of course, a Republican to a Democratic White House, also a change in terms of control of the Senate, and that's important to keep that in mind. The major actors involved in the response in Canada, it was mainly the federal government in terms of public spending, economic policy, and social protection. But the provinces and territories played a major role in terms of public health, and also in the case of healthcare, they are really the central players. So it's a very decentralized system when we talk about social services and healthcare. But when we talk about sending checks to people, cash to people, the federal government is a key actor. Finally, about universal programs, people excluded from them or people who have suffered the most during the pandemic. In Canada, we have had an important discussion about women. Many women, disproportionate percentage of women were affected in some sectors of the economy, like restaurants, hotels, and so forth. Also, the flaws of our childcare system were really stressed by the pandemic because some parents, but especially women, left the job market when schools closed and they didn't have access to childcare. And that created, I think, a lot of, I would say, political attention towards childcare, which is now really top of the agenda in Canada. There are also other groups. Canada, more than 20% of the population was born abroad. We have very diverse country, and racialized minorities like Black people, for example, were on average more affected by the pandemic, in part because they are on average, they earn less money. So they are more vulnerable towards the pandemic. The same thing with Indigenous peoples. And so, there are inequalities that are quite obvious, and social programming has not been able to offset or reduce all these inequalities. So there is a great awareness of these racial and ethnic inequalities related to Indigenous peoples, Black people, and so forth in a very diverse and multicultural country. Thank you.
지금 이런 답변에 대해서 어떻게 5분 동안
So,
질문에 대해서 답변하실 수 있겠습니까?
I mean, it's
불가능하기를 좀
practically
해주시겠습니다. 사실 이러한
impossible
토론은
to
오늘 밤까지
answer in
진행해야
5
되는
minutes
그나마
all
조금
of
더
these
내용을
questions. I think that we need the
가져가면서
entire
서로
day, or
대화를 할수
we
있을
have
것
to
같습니다.
use the all
그 점은
night.
참 아쉽게
But I
생각하고요.
believe that it's quite
중간에
unfortunate that we have
한
such
가지
limited time.
고이시 교수님하고 김연경 박사님의
Professor
답변을 끝난
Koishi
다음에는
and
진화 토론을 할 건데
research fellow
이때는
Dr. Kim
발표자
Hyun-kyung
분들도 서로
will
질문을
also
해주실 수가 있으니까
mention and
그 점을
explain
미리
their
말씀을
answers, but
드립니다.
then afterwards we'll
준비하실
also have
분들도
time for
그러면
discussants
다음
to
고이시 교수님 먼저 듣도록 하겠습니다.
provide their answers. And now, Professor
감사합니다.
Koishi?
저는 한국말로 하겠습니다.
Yes, I will answer in
코로나
Korean.
때문에 한국말 쓸 기회가 없기 때문에
Due to
좀
COVID-19, I
걱정입니다.
never have
이해가 잘
any
못되면
chances to
죄송합니다.
speak Korean, so I'm sorry if my Korean is rusty.
그 일본에서는
So in Japan,
그 정권 바뀌었거든요. 그 처음에는 그 아베 수상 시대였고
first it was Prime Minister Abe, and then in the middle, because of his deteriorating health, we had a new Prime Minister, Suga.
기시다 수상이 그 정권을 그 잡았습니다.
And then Kishida also took
그
office.
이거 그 첫 번째 질문하고 관계가
So I
있는데
believe that this is also in line
그
with the first
경제적
question.
그 의미가 있는지 사회적
What kind
그
of
선택인지 그
policy
크게
is it, whether
문제인데
it's a stimulus package for economy or society? In Japan,
정권이었을
when it was Prime Minister Suga,
그 경제적 그 정책에 대해서 많이 관심을 가지고
he was very interested in economic policies
특히 그
and boosting the economy.
그 임식 그 호텔이거든. 그 여행을 많이 사람들이 안
Because a lot of people were restricted in travel, in order to promote the hotel and accommodation industry, it was subsidies and grants to support those people who traveled. And so Prime Minister Suga was quite proactive in that area. And then after the end of the year, a lot of the public were quite complaining about that policy with the increase in the number of COVID patients. And then after Prime Minister Kishida took office,
지금도 기시다 그 많이 그 지금 코로나가
of course, we still have a lot of COVID-19 cases, and it's not as serious, but so Prime Minister Kishida is more focusing on COVID-related policies. So rather than economic policies, it's more about the livelihoods of the public and improving the lifestyles and society. The government has supported their own policies, but the amount itself for the budget is not that large. Last year, the subsidies and support for travelers was allocated, but in fact, there weren't many people who traveled, so they were not able to use that budget. And this year as well, of course, it's earmarked for that aspect, but not a lot of people are actually making use and getting the support. In fact, those people who are taking out the support are not that high. So whether this is credible or not, I think that this requires a bit of caution. So whether it's a selective policy or universal coverage, I think last year the government provided universal coverage. However, last year there was a lot of discussions and controversy, and they did provide everyone with the support. However, because they need to come up with the standards and criteria, the government was just announcing that they will provide it. However, they were quite late in actually providing the funds. So the Liberal Democratic Party has to think about whether they can implement this effectively or not, because it needs to be immediate. If this is selective, the actual municipality that has to implement that policy will have a lot of challenges and difficulties. So the government also knows that it's unrealistic for a selective offering of the policy. That's why they have announced that it's going to be a universal coverage. So I mentioned that the household debt and deficit is quite high. So if this proceeds on for a long time, it's going to be a burden on the country. So there was a magazine in the media that mentioned that it's going to be a critical issue. But the government actually mentioned that the long-term debt is quite higher compared to other countries. So the government has mentioned that this will be problematic compared to other countries in the future, in the longer term. And even with the prices, it was a deflation period. So there's not that many that are actually bearing the brunt of the long-term debt. Can I continue on? Yes, and so Dr. Lim asked that whether the COVID-19 policies
그 변화가 있을 건지 아닌지에 관해서는
will
저는
be able
부정적입니다.
to transition the
왜냐하면
country into a
이번에
welfare
그
state or
제가
not.
아까 그
I'm
발표하는
quite
대로
pessimistic about that.
이번 정부의 대책은 임시적인 거고
The Japanese government
그리고 그
is thinking of these policies as
제도는
temporary
바꾸지 않고
measures.
그리고 기존의 제도를 그 쓰지 않고 그 이전에 일반적으로 임시적인 그
And
조치나
they're not actually
현금을
extending the existing
지급하고
policies, but
그
it's over
생활보호나
more of a
보건보험
band-aid policy
지급자를
that
그
will be temporary
지정하지 않기 위해서
to
그
curb
임시적인 그 제도
the
그
rising
제도를 많이 프로그램 많이
unemployment
더
and the
있습니다.
societal issues.
그러니까 그 정부의 생각으로서는
From the
그
government's
아직
perspective,
그 역시 코로나 대책은 임시적인
COVID-19 policies are
문제 때문에 혹시 그 생활보호나
are
고용보험
temporary,
수급자가
so
많아지면은
with
이건
more
즉각적으로
recipients
그
of
정부
the
지출이
support,
많아질 가능성이 있기 때문에
there will
오히려
be an
그
increase
기존의
in
그
the number
제도는
of debtors
그만
as well as the recipients in the
그만
longer
그
term.
그대로 그 유지하고 그
So
임시적인
they're
그 임대나 현금 지원 그 현금
using or maintaining the existing policies and putting the temporary policies on top of the existing ones as
일본의 복지제도에
a one-off
긍정적인
measure.
변화를 가질 수 있는지에 관해서는 저는 부정적입니다.
And whether or not Japan can actually transition into a welfare state, I'm quite pessimistic about that issue.
이번에 그 코로나 대책으로서
As an option for COVID-19 measures, if there are those who are unemployed and need and cannot provide monthly rent, we did have these unemployment support on rent.
원래는 그 실업자에 대해서 지급하는 제도이지만은
This is a policy that's catered towards the unemployed. However,
그 실업자 안아도 그 보편적으로 그 주택 수단으로서
I believe that this should transition into a permanent policy for household relief or household support for rent, even if you are not unemployed.
예를 들면은 오사카시가
For example, in the city of Osaka,
그 제도를 보편적인 그 주택 수단으로서
this is being provided as household support, as a radical support,
제안을 중앙 정부에 대해서 하려고 하고 있습니다.
and they're preparing to move forward with this policy as a permanent policy. It's not official yet. It's as an unofficial movement towards the new direction. Lastly, for travelers and tourists, just like Canada, there's a lot of women, and there's a lot of those who women who commit suicide, and there's a lot of concerns that the deteriorating status of women in the society is becoming an issue. But because of COVID-19, a lot of women who are in the service industry and tourism industry have been direly affected. So for single-parent households, the Japanese government is also listing on the agenda issues, societal issues related to single-parent households as well. So you also mentioned about the effect of the policies, but there's also certain issues and challenges that we are not facing right now, but I believe that it's a common factor in different countries. So before we move on to the discussion, Dr. Kim?
And there are so many other experts who are able to talk about the Korean situation, so I'd like to give you another aspect. And in relations to European market or European countries, there was a conference like this in the past, but it was difficult to get all the speakers involved in Europe and America and Korea all together at the same time. So that's why we could not include the European speakers. So that was a pity. But in preparing for this conference, we received your presentation materials in advance, and looking into it, we found it very interesting. And what comes in common is that there was income support or subsidy from governments around the world. And in today's presentations, much of the content was related to cash support. But last time when we had the discussion on European countries, there was content much related to employment security. And the European countries are experienced in promoting and reinforcing employment security. So through that conference, we were able to listen to the examples of Europe and UK as well. They did not have the employment retention program. However, through the COVID-19 crisis, they introduced such policy. And just like Canada, through the real-time income identification system, the UK has designed their program in order to give support to every type of income class in terms of employment security. And also, Korea is also working on gaining and identifying exact income information of people. So that's why we wondered if other countries who are really are doing a good job in identifying the real income of every citizen. So there were a lot of job losses, especially among part-timers in Europe. That's what we heard. And also, even if they had the income identification system, they still have a problem in collecting the right and exact information about self-employed people. That's what we heard from the last conference on Europe. So my understanding is that through the real-time income identification data system, Canada has also executed the program. So do you think that Korea also needs to follow the steps of Canada? And what about what kind of way did you adopt to identify the income information about self-employed people in Canada? This is a question to Professor Daniel Belland. And also, I'd like to continue with my questioning to other speakers. So politically, there is a heated debate in other countries, but overcoming or experiencing the COVID-19 crisis. But we need to gain more experience of responding to the crisis through social policies. Back in the 1990s, we experienced a financial crisis, and with that crisis, Korea began to introduce new social programs like the introduction of the basic livelihood security system. However, in fact, in case of the 2008 financial crisis, the financial crisis in 2008 did not have a big impact in Korea. But and after some time, we have now encountered the COVID-19 crisis. More recently, the employment security program has been introduced right after seeing a sharp decline in employment rate here in Korea. So looking at the examples of other countries, we try to learn lessons about what policies or directions we need to take. So in the long term, the welfare system of Korea, would it be changing permanently? So this is the question that I want to ask to the moderator, Ms. Lee and Professor Choi. As a moderator, I cannot answer your question. It is quite surprising that a moderator gets this kind of question. But actually, we are in online settings because of the time differences. We could not get other countries' speakers involved in this conference. I really hope that we can see face-to-face, or we can see all the relevant experts all together in the future once we overcome the COVID-19 crisis. Every country has different situations, so that's why they have different experience. So I assume that even the speakers of today may have some questions to each other. So from now on, I'd like to go into a comprehensive discussion. So including a moderator, we can exchange questions and answers. So I'd like to ask speakers and discussants to exchange questions and answers with each other. But I'd like to ask for your understanding, since this is an online settings. So when you have a question, please raise your hand so that we can pass the microphone or turn over the microphone to the person concerned. So I'd like to invite you to take the floor if you have any questions.
Of course, if you did not have a lot of time to answer, you can also make use of this time. So I would just like to elaborate on the U.S. example. Yes, Professor Kim. Can I have the floor? Yes. So in the case of the U.S., going through the COVID-19 pandemic, I think that the society has been turned into a progressive society. If you think about 2 years ago, the key discussions were about social security systems from the Trump administration was that they were going to abolish some of the tax systems or the pension system, and it was at threat. But in just 2 years, I personally believe that it's transitioned over to a very progressive discussion, looking at a more progressive policy compared to the New Deal policy. It has now passed the House of Representatives, and it's now been discussed at the Senate. Of course, the overall budget has been reduced. However, nevertheless, the discussions going on in itself is a huge step towards the progressive policies. So they had 3 different stimulus support packages, and then in just 20 weeks, they also had unemployment support. There were also social security and welfare-related policies and support. But I believe that the public has now a different look or the perspective on progressive policies. I believe this also adds into the policymakers thinking about progressive policies. I only introduced the federal policies, but if you think about the central government's policies with the GOP and the Democrats, there's not that much of a difference. Even with the California federal law, they provided $600 per person in July of last year, but all of the party makers in the Senate and the House at the time agreed and supported this bill. So I think overall the lawmakers as well as the public have now turned into a progressive stance. And the discussions that are going on right now between the Democrats and and the GOP party, it's more about the timing and stance rather than whether or not they oppose or support. Also, to implement the tax system and policies that can support that. Of course, there's a wide spectrum within the different parties. So in terms of the speed and the stance, I think there are differences. Yes, I think that the Korean story is also quite interesting. I think that Professor Choi Young-jun might be able to support this answer. If you look back on the history of Korea, it's not that long either. So lawmakers that are progressivists and those who are conservatives, there are some times in which their overall direction over social policies are quite vague. There are lawmakers who have conservative stances that support socialist policies and vice versa. In Korea, the education and understanding of policies still needs time. I think that this needs to be clear in order for the media as well as the public, the wider public, to understand it and support it. If you have any other questions or comments, if you have a question, if you're participating online, please use the raise hand function. And Professor Che, I think that Japan wasn't able to answer, but maybe you can add your comments.
네, 갑자기 훅 들어와서.
Yes, so it's a bit sudden,
글쎄요,
but
저는 김현경 박사님께서 말씀하셨던 그 경험의 중요성.
But I think that the importance of experience that Dr. Kim has mentioned was
특히 어떻게 보면
interesting.
보건 분야에서는
In particular, in terms of welfare and social affairs,
좋은 성적표를 한국이
I think that
거두었었는데
South Korea or Republic of Korea had a good scorecard. But in the past, when we dealt with SARS and MERS, I think those experiences made the foundation to our response. I think that it's still controversial, but I think that we did quite well. But I think for social policies, there are those aspects in which we lack those experiences. Nevertheless,
이 전체적으로 사실 보편적이냐 선별적이냐
whether it's universal or selective, that's also a very important discussion point. However, if you think about those business owners or certain levels of society need the clearer support and response, but they're not being able to do so. Why is it? That's still something that I have a question about. For example, Professor Kim Tae-gun also mentioned during his presentation that not only the president, but also the Democrats that have a majority over the seats in the Senate and the House, how the progressive party and progressive lawmakers, even if they have over 2/3 of the National Assembly, are still quite reluctant and passive about these aspects. How do we interpret this? Or how do we overcome the bureaucratic government? Or how do we overcome the changes or the differences in economic structure? How can we get to a fiscal stability and fiscal prudence?
보수주의 컨서버티즘 아니면 재정적인 조심주의 이런 것들이 계속 지배를 하고 있어서 그런 것인지에 대해서
And maybe it's because of the fiscal conservatism that's prevalent in the government. I personally want to look in deeper and have more time for analysis for this. I do think that I might sound quite out of line if we're just talking about Korea, but I participated in a lot of these international forums, but I realized that it was Korea that was going in the wrong direction. That's why I had this constant question of why it is so. If you summarize the comments of Professor Che and the presenters, I think that we have two different issues in complementing these policies. The conservative and the progressive aspects of recovery, and the other one is the evaluation on the infrastructure that measures and evaluates income. So how accurate or how well was that established and progressed? I think that you also need to consider the conservative aspects, but also how much of an accurate evaluation do you have on the income levels of the public? I think that you have these two issues. We talked about the Canadian aspect of fiscal stability and fiscal soundness. But what about the accuracy as well as speed of evaluating the income levels and the infrastructure? So if you have any comments on that aspect, please feel free to add your opinions.
Yes, I can go in terms of Canada. Well, first of all, the distinction between the progressive and the conservative approaches to recovery and to emergency social policy. I think in Canada you have a strong contrast between the Liberals, who are on the center left, and the Conservative Party on the center right. And the Conservatives supported short-term emergency measures, but they advocated the end of these measures as soon as the economy started to recover. And they certainly don't want some of the temporary measures to lead to a permanent expansion of the welfare state in Canada. And that's a major difference with the Liberals, who of course expanded the welfare state before the pandemic and want to expand it even further after the pandemic. The Conservatives supported the Canada Emergency, the CRB I mentioned earlier. They supported the early rescue package, if you want, that was adopted. But they have been very critical of the government, stating that they are, extending support for a too long period of time, that this is creating in some areas of the country labor shortages, that they are spending too much. They should try to go back to normal sooner rather than later. So there is a difference here. Even if at the beginning of the pandemic they agreed that bold measures were needed, it's what happens later on that where you see a divergence, really an ideological divergence in Canada. Regarding the issue of income and assessing income, it's quite complicated. When we talk about the CRB, the Canada Emergency Recovery Benefit, it's individuals who were basically asked to self-assess their own income, including the self-employed. And many people are not, they are not accountants, they are not so good at it. And so, for example, quite a few people, they calculated their income in terms of gross income, so before tax, right? And so, and that created some confusion. They didn't exactly know how to calculate their income. They didn't read the fine print, if you want, on the government website. And now these people have to repay. And that's creating some anxiety, especially for people who have already spent all this money. So I think that in French we say you cannot cook an omelette without breaking eggs. And in Canada we have, cracked quite a few eggs, and we have spilled some egg yolk on the floor. But in the end, we were quite successful in spending money rapidly, helping people. But then some people have to pay back, and sometimes it's hard for them. The government has forgiven some people and say, okay, it was a, we won't be too harsh on you. But there are still many, many people who have to pay back through the tax system. And that creates, in some cases, a lot of economic anxiety and even insecurity in that sense.
예, 감사합니다. 또 다른
Thank you for the answer.
질문해 주실,
Is there anyone who wants to make comments on this matter? So I'd like to take some opinions from one person,
해야 될 것 같습니다.
and then maybe it's time to wrap up the discussion after hearing from one person. So is there anyone who wants to present their opinion?
So I will add a comment once again. If you look at the policies to respond to COVID-19, both parties, as well as the Fed, did not mention anything about the deficit. Before, whenever there were any comments around social policies, they always brought up the deficit issue. However, this time around, we're looking at the unprecedented largest social policy ever, but they're not talking about deficits. And even with the GOP party makers, they're not talking about the or opposing it, talking about the deficit. I believe that that's one of the key characteristics of this time. Now in the politics as well as the financial circles, they're looking more about the growth. So if the growth outweighs the deficits, they think that it can be offset. So that's why they're not talking about any deficit issue, but it's more about the stimulus packages of stage 1, 2, and 3, but it's more about the inflation issues. As I mentioned before, Jerome Powell from the Fed also mentioned that it's just a temporary issue and that we can actually offset it through growth. So I think that that was a major strategy. Related to tax systems and the measurement of tax systems, I think that there was a confidence among the lawmakers that they could do a good job of evaluating. There's a lot of issues related to tax reform in the policies. They have a strong tax policy, but they're actually thinking of reinforcing those tax policies. And once those come into effect, the government will be able to add about 200 trillion won to their coffers, and so that's why it will be able to offset that the deficit. And so in Korea, there's also a lot of consensus talking about reinforcing the tax system, having economic stimulus be morphed into the overall package deals. I think that that's also a good point. The Korean economy is talking about policies with stimulus packages involved in it. So I think that the conservative lawmakers are not really mentioning that. We don't have a lot of time left right now, but if you have any urgent comments that you must make, if you have anything that you really urgently need to talk about. Yes, if not, I would like to turn the floor over to Dr. Kim Yeon-kyung once again for preparing this forum. And behind the camera and backstage, we do have a researcher who has contributed greatly to this forum. You have to come a little bit closer. So, Ms. Kim Yeon-jin from KIHASA. Thank you once again, and I'm sure that you have had contact with her while preparing for this forum. Thank you very much for your contribution.
발표를 해주신 네 분,
Thank you to the four presenters
해주신 두 분,
and two
유창한
discussants,
한국말로 부러움을 샀던
and of course Professor Koishi for his great Korean.
위해서 수고해 주신 모든 분들
Thank you very much for your contributions and interventions.
들으면서 이 경험이
I
끝나도
truly felt that this experience was something to ruminate on and reflect back on after COVID is over.
좋겠다라는 생각이 듭니다.
And I truly hope that this will last. And if Dr. Kim Yeon-kyung
다시 한번 논의의
will be able to join together afterwards, it's an interesting topic that we can discuss later on once again. With that, I'd like to conclude my comments. Thank you very much.